Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the October 2024 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Furman. I'm the Deputy Director of NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past month. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, and Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide both an agricultural impacts update of the past month, as well as a summary of this past growing season. So again, thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder, type those questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording in the next day or so. All right, so let's get started with an overview of the climate. So over the past month, we see the temperatures were above average across the northern tier of the region, as well as the Florida Peninsula, and near average across the middle of the region. Temperatures continue to run above average across the Caribbean, with several locations once again on track to record record or near record warmth for the month. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that this heat has been very persistent, not just over the past few months, but over the past year and even past couple of years. On the left, we see the all-time longest runs of consecutive days with temperatures of at least 90 degrees in San Juan, and we're currently in the longest such stretch on record, going all the way back to September the 9th. In fact, we can add one more day to that record as the temperature exceeded 90 degrees yesterday. So now we're at 43 consecutive days. And if we look at the number of 90-degree days throughout the year there on the right, we see that after we add yesterday to the total, we're now just 7 days shy of the all-time record of 172 days set back in 1983. And it should come as no surprise that San Juan is on pace to record its warmest year on record, nearly a full degree Fahrenheit above the previous record at this time of the year. Okay, next slide. So as was the case last month, the pattern of precipitation over the region was driven largely by the occurrence of tropical systems. Here we see the footprint of Hurricane Helene, which extends from the Big Bend region of Florida into the southern Appalachians, and the footprint of Hurricane Milton, which extends across a large portion of the Florida Peninsula, especially the I-4 corridor. We'll talk more about these storms in a minute. Areas that missed out on the rain from these systems, including much of Alabama, western Tennessee, and eastern portions of the Carolinas and Virginia, didn't see much else over the past month. And this has led to an expansion of drought in these areas, as we'll see in a later slide. It's also been dry in the Caribbean, which has led to moisture deficits across parts of the islands there. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about the two biggest weather stories over the past month, beginning with Hurricane Helene. Helene made landfall near Perry, Florida on September the 26th as a Category 4 storm with winds of 140 miles an hour, making it one of the largest and strongest hurricanes to hit Florida's Big Bend region. Despite weakening rapidly after landfall, its fast size and fast movement led to hurricane force winds reaching as far inland as northern Georgia and western North Carolina. The storm's impacts were catastrophic, to say the least, including record-breaking storm surge that exceeded 15 feet in places, extensive flooding, and landslides in western North Carolina. Florida experienced unprecedented storm surges in places like Cedar Key and Old Port Tampa, surpassing previous records by more than 2 feet in some cases. Wind gusts reached 100 miles an hour in parts of Georgia, and reached 106 miles an hour on the summit of Mount Mitchell. Helene brought historic rainfall to the region, with over 10 inches falling across parts of Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and even into parts of Virginia. Western North Carolina saw the heaviest rainfall, with over 31 inches recorded at Busick between the 25th and 28th of September. This excessive precipitation caused rivers like the French Broad and the Swannanoa to surpass record flood levels, leading to severe flooding in towns such as Asheville, Black Mountain, and Chimney Rock. Mudslides and landslides further compounded the destruction in these places and others as well. Helene also spawned 40 tornadoes, with the strongest, an EF3, hitting Rocky Mount, North Carolina, causing significant damage and several injuries. Helene left over 700,000 people at one point without power in North Carolina, with infrastructure severely damaged. Approximately 250 fatalities have been confirmed so far, making Helene the deadliest hurricane in the U.S. since Katrina. The majority of deaths occurred in North Carolina, where nearly 100 people, as of today, remain missing. A detailed climatological analysis of Helene can be found in our September climate report, which is located at the link there at the bottom of the slide. I'll also say that the state climate offices from Tennessee and North Carolina also have information and resources pertaining to Helene, and we'll provide those links to you in the webinar recap. Okay, next slide. So less than 2 weeks after Helene, Hurricane Milton made landfall near Siesta Key, Florida, as a Category 3 hurricane with winds of 120 miles an hour. Milton was the second strongest hurricane on record in the Gulf of Mexico, behind only Rita, and was the fifth strongest hurricane on record in the Atlantic Basin. The impacts from Milton were significant and included wind gusts over 100 miles an hour in the Tampa Bay area, rainfall between 10 and 20 inches along the I-4 corridor, storm surge of 5 to 10 feet extending from Naples to Sarasota, and a large tornado outbreak across parts of South Florida. Extensive flooding was reported throughout Hillsborough County and up towards Orlando, and also areas south of Jacksonville. Several rivers, including the St. Johns and Hillsborough rivers, crested multiple feet above their record flood stages. There was significant concern over potentially catastrophic storm surge in Tampa Bay. However, a southern shift in Milton's track prior to landfall spared the area and even resulted in a reverse surge of several feet. Perhaps the most notable impact from Milton was the unusually large and destructive outbreak of tornadoes. To date, there have been 47 confirmed tornadoes from Milton. We actually added one more earlier this morning, and that includes 6 EF2s and 3 EF3 tornadoes, one of which killed 6 people near Fort Pierce. Based on prior research that we've done at the Southeast Regional Climate Center, this may be the strongest tornado outbreak spawned by a tropical cyclone since 1973. And the strongest tornado outbreak in the state of Florida since 1950. In all, there have been at least 30 deaths associated with Milton, with estimated damages approaching $30 billion. That would actually make Milton one of the top 10 costliest hurricanes on record in the United States. Okay, next slide. So looking at the drought monitor, we've seen significant improvements over the past month due to hurricanes Helene and Milton. Though areas of moderate to severe drought and even some extreme drought continue to persist across parts of Alabama and Tennessee, as do some areas of abnormal dryness across parts of Northern Virginia. Abnormal dryness was also recently introduced across eastern portions of Georgia and South Carolina, which largely missed out on the rain from the recent tropical systems. And we also saw abnormal dryness reemerge in southern portions of Puerto Rico. Okay, next slide. So the tropical Pacific continued to reflect ENSO neutral conditions over the past month. Most of the indicators we use to determine what phase we're in, including sea surface temperature anomalies, trade wind strength, rainfall patterns, etc., have been hovering close to the La Nina thresholds, but haven't quite crossed them yet. And while most models continue to show La Nina eventually developing within the next month or so, the CPC is less confident than it was back in September. And so they've dropped the overall chance of development from 70 to 60%. Historically, as we get closer to winter, the chances of development start to go down anyway. And if La Nina does in fact come to fruition, it's likely to be a weak event, which could mean less consistent impacts across the region with respect to temperature, precipitation, and other weather patterns. Okay, next slide. Now, while forecast confidence has decreased somewhat, the chances of La Nina developing are still better than the chances that it will not. And so the seasonal outlooks that were released by the CPC last week do in fact show a pattern that largely reflects the overall influence of La Nina, which means above average temperatures for the southeast and below average precipitation, except maybe across northern and interior portions of the region. They have equal chances of below and above average precipitation this upcoming winter. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see in the Caribbean that above average temperatures and precipitation are, again, expected to continue through the remainder of fall and into early winter. Okay, next slide. Looking at the seasonal drought outlook, we see that drought is expected to expand across much of Alabama, extreme northwestern Florida, and parts of southern Tennessee over the next few months. While conditions are expected to worsen, perhaps across eastern portions of Georgia and South Carolina, at least for now, no new development is expected across the U.S. Caribbean. Okay, next slide. Looking ahead to this weekend and early next week, above average temperatures are favored across the entire region. It will be dry as well, except maybe across southern Georgia and parts of Florida where above average precipitation is expected. Okay, next slide. And if we look out to later next week and into next weekend, we see a continuation of this pattern with dry conditions across northern and interior portions of the region, and perhaps wetter than average conditions across much of Florida and eastern portions of Georgia and South Carolina. It'll be interesting to see how this unfolds, as there are several locations across the middle portion of the region, places like Nashville, Huntsville, Birmingham, Atlanta, Athens, Augusta, Columbia. I'm probably missing a few, but those are some of the big ones that have yet to record any measurable rain so far this month. Okay, next slide. And finally, as we look ahead to November, we see a warm and generally dry pattern across much of the region, with equal chances of above and below average precipitation across the northern tier of the region and across South Florida. Okay, next slide. Okay, and here's the summary for you to look over after the webinar. I also want to acknowledge our service climatologist, William Schmitz, who helped compile much of this information, especially all the tornado data from Milton, which continues to come in. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Todd for our water resources update.
Thank you very much. So, I'll go ahead and we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So our fall to winter outlook. So it's interesting. Looks like at some point USGS has had some interesting a blip in their data. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, we'll talk about that one first, then we'll talk about the blip in the data. But this is the 28-day average stream flow across the Southeast, and you can see that over from Florida all the way up through the Carolinas, nearly everywhere is above normal. There are a few near normal as we get a little closer to the coast, but as a whole, the whole area is seeing above normal stream flows. As you get almost to the Alabama line to the west, we have normal to some below normal in those cases. And we started our new water year at the beginning of October, and usually part of the reason, at least in the Southeast, it's kind of the drier time of year. So it's a good time to start the water year. As we start to talk through this part of the briefing, and we've said it many times before, it's either feast or famine during this time of year. Either you are usually very, very wet, or you are very, very dry. And we've had both. We've had very, very wet short periods of time, and then we've had very, very dry. But as you look on the right-hand side, and you can see how we went from dry in the summer to wet in the late summer, and then back down to kind of normal, and then again wet for over the whole Southeast. But we do have this area in here where we have some missing data, and so I show the 28-day average stream flow in these, but I'm going to show the 7-day average as we start to look at the states. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide and start to look a little bit more closely at the states, and that kind of takes out some of that bad data, and we can look and see where our stream flows are as with respect to the current day and where we are with respect to this time of year. So these are our 7-day average runoff for our rivers in the Southeast, and the first one is Alabama, and you can see that they have had some rainfall. Alabama received rainfall from earlier storms, something that was a little further west of our area. And so they didn't miss out. They just missed out on the two larger storms, Helene and Milton, as they moved in a little later in the season. But they were in the normal range. But again, they're starting to fall very quickly. As you go to Georgia, you see a similar pattern in that we saw excessive rainfall during Helene over much of Georgia. And since that time, there has been like no rain. And as mentioned before, we have gone at least through October where the Atlanta airport hasn't seen any rain. And if we get to the end of the month without any rain, that will be the first time ever that we have had a month with zero rainfall at the Atlanta airport, which is very interesting. But we've been very, very dry. So the rivers have fallen off more quickly during that time. And so we see that precipitous fall over the last 20 days or so since we had all of that rainfall. And if you go to Florida, it's kind of the opposite. As we approach the dry season, we've gotten through the end of kind of our wet season in Florida. However, Milton has kind of flipped that on its head, and we've seen plenty of water to last us for a very long time. And we'll talk about that in just a minute when we look at our stream flows and what's in flood right now. But Florida is very wet as they go into their dry season, and with the possible La Niña and the drying down there, they could benefit from some dry couple of months coming up. So let's go ahead and move a little further north with the next slide, and the South Carolina. Again, South Carolina saw, while North Carolina got a lot of the highlights, there was still a great deal of rain in South Carolina, with some significant flooding in parts of South Carolina that moved all the way through the state and caused problems in those areas. So South Carolina did receive extensive rainfall also, and extensive flooding. North Carolina obviously saw a lot of that, a little bit less as we moved further east towards the coast, but a lot of that water moved from the mountains all the way through the state, and did keep stream flows pretty high. So even though some areas didn't receive quite as much rainfall, the rivers still did flow fairly high in some of those areas. Virginia was the same way. A lot of that area in the mountains saw extreme rainfall, but it all has to move down towards the coast. And so those stream flows, even though maybe some of those areas didn't receive as much rainfall, still those rivers still saw a lot of that stream flow as it moved through the state. So from a stream flow perspective, that's why you were looking at that 28-day average, where we're above normal throughout the state. And we will see how that changes as we get into winter and into fall. So let's go ahead, or fall into winter, pardon me. So let's go ahead and go and look and see where we are right now in the next slide with respect to flooding in the southeast. And so a lot of that from Helene has finally moved off the coast, and we don't see a lot of those impacts as you look in Georgia up through the Carolinas and Virginia. However, Milton has taken its toll on Florida. Many forecasts in Florida, many of those may stay in flood through the month of November, even though we have kind of dried out. Water moves pretty slowly, and so in Florida, because it's so flat. And so over on the eastern side of the, it looks like it will stay wet and stay above in major flood stage along the St. Johns as it moves north towards Jacksonville. And then we also have the Withlacoochee that is moving. We've got water moving up. We've still got another week or so, at least another week, maybe 2 weeks before we crest, and then it will take some time for that water to get out of the system. So it does take a great deal of time for water to move out of those systems, especially with as much water as we had during that time. So we remain in flood as we move into the dry season in Florida. So let's go to the next slide, and I'm just going to show a quick slide about, this is what we were looking at last month during the webinar. I went ahead and left the date on there because we were concerned about the rainfall from Helene and the footprint it would leave. And so you can see that a lot of South Carolina, we were concerned about Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, into Virginia. So now we'll go to the snapshot right after the storm, which is on the next slide. And you'll see that that footprint, it was fairly extensive. And you can see that not only was it Georgia, not only was it North Carolina, but a lot of South Carolina had impacts from that. And even as we got further closer to the coast, a lot of those outer bands along in South Carolina, along the Waccamaw River and along those rivers did see. So we did see, that's why we're not seeing, because we're so dry this time of year, that's why we're not seeing any drought conditions developing widespread, because we did have so much rain and we are still recovering from that. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide to talk about our climatology and where we are for this time of year. And we're in week 43, and this is for the southeast, and this is usually a time of year that we start to slow down a little bit. It's between our tropical season and we start to gear up for our winter recharge flood season. And that is exactly what's happening. We have slowed down. We don't have as many floods in those areas, and so we're quiet for a little while. And all depending on how the La Nina develops and whether we're in neutral conditions. La Nina would tend to keep us a little bit drier, as was shown by the forecast from the Climate Prediction Center for the season. But if we stay in neutral or we just barely get into La Nina, maybe we'll be more normal as we go into it, because the biggest concern going forward is dryness. But because we're maybe not going to get that La Nina, maybe we won't get as dry as we were originally expecting. So this is our general southeast look. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which shows the Florida climatology. And you can see that the October, that end of tropical season where we get busy, we did do that. And now we're finally, while we're still in flood, that rain is starting to back off. The pattern's changing. We're not having as much tropical rainfall in Florida. Fronts are starting to move through, and that pattern is starting to change. So this is typically is a quieter time of year for Florida, and we're hoping for that because we know how busy they've been and we know how much water they've had. And it does look like we're finally starting to get into some a dry time for them, and that should continue through even if we do have a La Nina. They typically are dry during this time of year anyway, so it looks like they're going to have a break for the next few months. And so the last slide is just kind of our outlook. And while we have normal risk for flooding, although we've been dry, rivers are still high, so we're still vulnerable. So if we do that pattern changes and we start to get into a more rainy pattern, we could start to see some flooding. We're also losing leaves from trees. Soon, a lot of that rainfall, if it happens, will be runoff. So we're kind of a normal risk for flooding. We might say below normal if we were looking at a strong La Nina, but we're not there yet. And so really that November to January timeframe looks more normal. We're still at a slightly above normal risk for river flooding in Florida. While it's coming to the dry season, rivers are still so full right now that it wouldn't take a lot to see them maybe rise a little bit back up and to have some impacts in those areas. So we have to be very careful about how we describe it. And since at least through a good chunk of November, those areas are going to be in flood anyway, we've kind of left it at the above normal. And so we go to my last slide, and it's just the overview slide. And so you can read this later, and I will pass it off to Pam.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Todd. It's a pleasure to be back this month. I've decided that in lieu of doing my usual ag outlook for just the last month, I would sort of wrap that all into the review of the 2024 growing season, just to give myself a little bit more time. Of course, probably the two biggest stories for the last month have been Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, and so that will be included in this discussion. So let's go on and get started. What is the growing season? Most of you probably know it, but in case you don't, typically it's defined as the time period between the last frost in spring and the first frost in the fall. And I picked Augusta sort of being in the middle of the region this year. This is a thermograph that the green band shows the average high and low temperature, the red the extreme highs for each day, and the blues the extreme lows for each day. And then superimposed on that, the gray bars are what actually has been happening so far in 2024. And I drew in there the 32-degree map or 32-degree line in gold, so you can kind of see where that is. You can see in Augusta, the last spring frost was in mid-March, and since then we've been above freezing for the whole time. We came very close to hitting it just a few days ago. Augusta got down to 35 degrees. So the growing season is still going on, as it is in most of the region. And you do notice that kind of blip there around the beginning of October. That is because of Hurricane Helene, which knocked out power to almost all the National Weather Service ASOS sites in the southeastern part of Georgia. And so we have a few days there with no data from those sites. And I just thought that would be interesting to put in there to remind you that, our data collection isn't perfect either. subject to the vagaries of the weather, sometimes as much as everything else. But you can see in general, I mean, the first part of the growing season was relatively warm. Then during the summer, we didn't have a lot of day-to-day variability in temperature. It was a little bit cooler, especially towards the end of July and going on from there. You'll see that in the growing degree days. And then since then, it's gotten a bit warmer again, and lately it's been quite warm. Although the last week, you can see we've gone down to much cooler temperatures, partly because it's been so dry, so it's easy for the temperature at night to drop. So if we go on, the growing season changes across different parts of the country. This is just a map of the number of days. You can see that Florida, of course, has much longer growing season than Northern Virginia does. And so even though a few of you are already at the end of your growing season, there are many others who are not. And what happens in the next month is going to be important for things like peanuts, because a lot of peanuts are behind this year because of late planting. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so they're really hoping that they get some more growing degree days and a little bit more time with their crops to make them a little bit more mature. Of course, there's also plants that can handle cold temperatures better. That's why you plant things like brassicas, cabbages, and related species to take care of to take advantage of the cooler weather. You don't grow those in the middle of the summer because they just don't grow very well. So they might not use a growing season at 32 degrees, but they might use one more at 28, which would be considered a killing frost. But this is for 32 degrees, and it shows you the variation across the region. Places like Puerto Rico, of course, don't have frost, and so they have a growing season that's 365 days long. We go on. Growing season has been changing over time as temperatures have been getting warmer. This is across the United States. So the western U.S. has a growing season that's changing more quickly than the eastern United States does. That may be related to changes in humidity, but we do see that it's really changing everywhere. And so that's something that farmers are having to watch, because if they use their old grandfathers' methods of when to plant, it may not be appropriate anymore. Because they may be able to take advantage of warmer temperatures early in the season and get an earlier start to the planting season. If we go on, this just shows the likely date of first freeze. They're using a 32-degree freeze here. And 50% just means that's the average date. You can go to agroclimate.org and see 10% and 90% as well. You can see right now we're kind of in the orange to yellow band, and really the only place that on the average has had a first frost by now is the western part of North Carolina and a few scattered counties in far northeast Georgia and in Alabama, which are probably more related to topography there as much as anything else. But most of the rest of us should not have expected to see frost so far. And if you look on the map on the right-hand side there, this is the lowest one-day minimum temperature that has been observed over the last month. And you can see that there's very few places that have gotten down to 30 or below. And certainly if you're talking about 25 to 30, that dark purple, that's mostly highland areas where you're in the mountains. And so I know in Georgia, about the only place that's really gotten down to really killing frost is Blairsville, which is in a mountain valley in the northeastern part of Georgia. And it's always the coldest spot in the state. So they have had killing frost. They're pretty much done with their growing season, but most of the rest of us may still be wandering around growing season for a while, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the talk. If we go on, if we look just sort of generally at the climate of the growing season starting in April 1st, I'm just picking April 1st because it's sort of an average for the region. Obviously, that's going to depend on where you are. The map on the left shows the temperature anomaly over that period. You'll notice it only goes through August, and that's because this is a product from the National Centers for Environmental Information in Asheville, North Carolina. They have been offline for a while. They did come back, but not all their products are up to date yet. They're still working on the summary for the September period, and it was not available here. So I don't think it really changes the pattern much. You can see generally across the region, temperatures have been a little bit above normal, but not a lot. And so temperature has not really been the big um, story this year. The bigger story has been precipitation. On the right-hand side, here's a departure from normal precipitation across the region. You can see um, parts of Florida, parts of Georgia, and the Carolinas have all been quite wet. Most of that rainfall, at least in large part, has been associated with the tropical storms and hurricanes, but not all of it. We've also had quite a bit of other rain as well, and I'll break that down by month in the next few slides coming up. So we go ahead and look at, first of all, one of the impacts of temperatures is growing degree days, which just tells you how much the temperature rises above a set threshold. This one is for 50, but you can go to agroclimate and put in other thresholds if you're interested in something a little warmer. Did this here just to show that the yellow line is what we expect from the long-term average. And early in the season this year, we were actually running ahead of the average accumulation for degree days. So if you got plants in early, they were able to grow pretty quickly as long as they had access to water and they didn't have too much water, which was a problem in many places, as we'll see. Definitely better accumulations this year than last year, which was shown in blue. But as you go into the second half of the season, you see that the number of growing degree days is falling short compared to the historical averages. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it was so rainy that kept the temperatures down. Of course, with the rain comes all the clouds, and that also cuts down on daytime high temperatures. And so up until the last month or so, we've been behind the long-term average. The last month has been warm and, as you know, very dry. And so we've been able to accumulate a lot more. Some of the crops are taking advantage of that and trying to catch up. Unfortunately, for some other crops, it's really too late. But we're still having a little bit of accumulation. Obviously, we can't accumulate to November 6th yet because it hasn't happened yet. So we'll be continuing to watch this. If you're interested in using agroclimate to monitor growing degree days in your own region, there's a website down on the bottom of the page that you can do that with. So now we're going to jump from temperatures, which were not that unusual this year, to precipitation. And so we'll go over and look at our next slide, which is about precipitation. And I broke this down by months. Not a perfect way to do it because, of course, weather doesn't exactly follow the calendar lines, but close enough so that you can kind of get a feel for what's going on. In April, you can see that a lot of the region was quite dry, except for southwestern Georgia and the panhandle, parts of the panhandle of Florida. Those wet conditions made it very hard for producers to get into the fields in those areas. You can't put heavy equipment onto the soil because it compacts the soil. You remove the air pockets in them, and so it's not really conducive to growing things. And also, I mean, your equipment gets stuck, and obviously you don't want that to happen either. And so, whereas many parts of the region were relatively dry in April, there was that area which is kind of the prime area for cotton and corn and later in the year peanuts as well. That they just couldn't really get into the fields very well, and so that was an issue. Even more so in May. If you look at the May map there in the center, you can see how wet it was. This is not tropical rain. This is just a lot of the rain that's happened. Very, very difficult. Some people that were able to get into the fields early in the year saw this rain happen, and it drowned out the early growing plants. In some cases, they had to replant either the same thing or a different crop to be able to get something in the fields because of those delays. And so we're still seeing those delays now in the peanut development because a lot of the peanuts are behind. They went through a late planting. They started out well, but because the growing degree days have been a little bit below the average, they're still kind of hanging in there. And in some cases, they may not make it till the first frost. It just depends when that first frost happens. June, by comparison, you can see June was really, really dry across most of the region. It was also quite warm during that time. And we had a lot of problems with drought building up in the areas, the flash drought, because there was very little rain. You had dryland crops and ones that were not irrigated, they were really struggling because of this. Even if they were able to get established in spite of all the rain, they had a lot of problems with this. And there were some cornfields that were really not able to set crop this year because it was a dry spell right in the middle of their pollination. And so if you have that happen during maybe the 2 week or so period of pollination of the corn, you pretty much have lost the crop. And so in that case, farmers can use that for silage, or they can try to grow something else instead. But it's a real problem that happens when you have drought timed at a very sensitive period in the development of the crop. And so that was definitely an issue. We go to the next slide. We continue on through the season. You can see July was quite wet across most of the region. There's a little bit of drought in the eastern part of Florida, but everywhere else was pretty much wet. It wiped out a lot of that. Of course, that was, again, before the tropical season happened. And so just wet conditions overall really dominated things in July. In August, we were in a period of feast or famine. Almost all that rainfall that occurs on the August map was from Debbie, Hurricane Debbie, tropical storm as it came over Georgia and the Carolinas, went out to sea and then sort of came back on shore later. But areas that got the tropical rain were in the surplus, whereas areas that did not feel the effects of Debbie were quite dry, and the drought there continued and caused, again, more problems for the crops in those areas. We know in the southeast that tropical rainfall is an important contributor to our total rainfall. If we don't have tropical rain, we are much more likely to go into a drought, and we certainly have seen that this year. I think estimates are sometimes somewhere between 10 and 40%, depending on how you're counting it, of the rainfall we get in the summer months, including the growing season, is from tropical activity. Certainly that's been the case this year. And so you can see that August was fairly dry, and a lot of this rain fell right at the beginning of August, and then most of the rest of August was quite dry because the tropics became very quiet. There's a long period when people wondered if the tropical season was already over, which of course is a dangerous thing to say when you have Gulf of Mexico temperatures that high, and we saw a return to much more tropical activity later in the season. You can see September there has been quite wet. September includes the impacts of Hurricane Helene, which caused a lot of rain. But even before Helene came on shore, there was also a big rain event that kind of set up the soil for being saturated. So that made Helene's rainfall all the more important because it was falling on land that just could not absorb any more rain. And that was really what contributed to a lot of the runoff and the flooding events from that. So the places that did not have as much rain went into more drought, and I heard some farmers were having to feed hay in the middle of the summer, which doesn't happen very often in the places where they didn't get any rain. So it's been kind of a whiplash summer as far as precipitation has gone, like a windshield wiper where we're going back and forth between well above normal and well below normal periods of rainfall. The farmers would, I think, prefer to get about an inch or inch and a half a week instead of getting 10 inches in a day. And so that certainly has been an issue for this growing season, and probably one of the biggest ones. If we go on to the next page, I have a little bit here about drought. When I moved to Georgia in January of 2001, I came in the middle of a multi-year drought, which lasted from 1998 to about 2002. This timeline shows the percent of the region that was covered by some kind of drought, and the darker the red is the more intense the drought was. So you can see since that time, we've had 2 additional multi-year droughts that have covered a lot of the southeast, one from about 2007 to 2009, and another one from about 2011 to 2013. We have had a few droughts since that time, but they have not been very long, and they have certainly not covered as much of the southeast as those previous droughts. I keep wondering, when are we going to get another one of those? And I think it's a matter of time. But so far, we've been fortunate that we have not had any of these really big, catastrophic droughts that have covered the whole region. And so I think we need to be happy for that. We go on to the next picture, the next page. This just takes a look at the last couple of years of the drought coverage of the southeast, starting in 2023 on the left-hand side of that timeline. You can see there were some dry conditions late in the year in 2023 because we had a really warm spring and not very much rain. So we had some drought over the winter months. That all was wiped out. by April 2, the beginning of the growing season, as you can see by the middle map there, where there's just a small area in eastern Carolinas where we had any dry conditions at all. Since that time, we started to go back into drought. The sort of the peak of the dry conditions was around July 16, where we hadn't really had much tropical rain yet. You can see how much it was increasing. And then when Debbie came right at the beginning of August, that percentage of coverage of drought dropped way back, started to rise again. And then when Helene came in late September, it continued to drop things back. So I think, and this is a pretty clear case of the tropics really affecting the drought that we experienced. If we had not had those tropical storms come over us, I think we would be in much worse condition. So even as bad as the results of these hurricanes was, it did provide some benefits in the form of rainfall that was beneficial, especially in areas that didn't get 2 feet in a day. If we go on, I think the other big story besides precipitation this growing season has been the tropical storms and hurricanes. And Chris and Todd have already talked a little bit about this. I'm going to talk more about the agricultural impacts of that. It's been a pretty active year this year for the Southeast. We don't always get this many tropical storms. And so there was that long lag period, and I know people are looking at why we had that, maybe related to the Matt and Juliet oscillation or other things. Every tropical season is different, and you cannot say necessarily everything's going to be front loaded in the beginning of the season or back loaded into the back of the season. In this case, it was kind of bifurcated, and so that was something that we always have to keep in mind. We're not out of the tropical season yet. There's still the possibility we could see another one, although it's becoming much less likely as we go down to the end of the season. And I just should note, I don't have a separate slide here, but Francine did come in to the west of Alabama, but it did bring some rain to Alabama, which I think mostly had beneficial results. It caused some reduction in, temporary at least, reduction in the drought conditions there. So, sometimes that's something we need to keep in mind as well. So let's jump into looking at the impacts of some of these different tropical systems on agriculture and in the growing season here. I talked about Debbie in an earlier month's webinar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This shows the rainfall map, which for Debbie, rainfall was really the key, I think, for a lot of the agricultural impacts, although the winds did cause issues, especially with tobacco. Tobacco was just about ready to be harvested, and in Georgia, they estimated they lost about 3/4 of the tobacco crop because of wind shredding on the leaves. They like to have the leaves whole because they sell for more money. A lot of that was shredded, and so tobacco is normally a very high value crop, which people grow sort of as an insurance, I think, in some cases, or because their families have always done it. And so that was a huge loss for them. For many people, the rainfall was enormous, and that was a real problem. There was a lot of erosion. I showed a picture last month, I think, of the erosion in some of the peanut fields that occurred because of that heavy rain. And then if you look at the estimated losses in Florida, depending on which one you use, they can go up to as much as 263 million because, of course, there's a lot of agriculture going on in the eastern part of the Panhandle and the northern part of Florida there, where they had a lot of those rains and winds as well. Anytime you're talking about damage from tropical storms, a lot of it is delayed because if you shake the plants because of the turbulent wind, sometimes that causes losses in yields and things like that. But you can't always quantify that till you actually harvest the area. So let's go on and look at the next storm. I just wanted to mention potential tropical cyclone 8, which hit southeastern North Carolina for the most part, brought some really heavy rain there. It doesn't have to be a named storm to cause a lot of impacts. And potential tropical cyclone 8 did provide up to 20 inches of rain in some of those areas. There was a lot of damage to infrastructure and roads. These areas were also hit by Debbie, so they're hit again by more rainfall. But it did reduce the drought somewhat in eastern parts of North Carolina, in spite of the flooding that occurred in some places. So it had minor benefits and some losses because of the rainfall, and not so much because of the wind, because it never did reach tropical storm force level. We go on. Now we're going to look at Helene. And Helene, I put the map here that shows where the National Hurricane Center said the hurricane winds did. If you are in the middle of trying to figure out crop insurance, this is the map that's being used to determine where the hurricane winds were. It is in the process, I think, of being revised right now, because there was a lot of hurricane winds that occurred east of the path of the eye of the storm that were not accounted for in this particular track map. You can see that if you look at the map on the right-hand side here. This shows where agricultural production was occurring, and overlaid with where the power outages were. The power outages covered most of the eastern half of Georgia, as well as stretching up into South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia as well, and down, of course, in Florida. So you can see that in this case, a lot of the worst winds were not near the eye, but were actually to the east of the eye. And that's causing some problems for people that want to collect hurricane insurance. And so I'm going to probably be writing an article for my blog about that later, because I think that's a real problem for a lot of farmers who had really terrible damage. You can see all the different kinds of things that are produced in those areas. There's poultry, both growing eggs and growing broilers for eating chickens, a lot of pecans and other things too. There was damage, surprisingly, to blueberry bushes that were all blown over, and even some peaches, although not too much. Mostly with peaches, it was some limb losses because it's past the harvest season. Vegetables, a lot of farmers are starting to prepare for strawberries, so they've laid down plastic. A lot of that was blown away. Cattle losses, because in dairy, at least with milk, quite a few of the dairies lost power and even had trouble getting fuel to keep running their generators, because just took a long time to be able to get power back in many of those places. I had friends that are extension agents in that part of the state that were without power for more than 2 weeks. And so you can just imagine what that's like. Corn was towards the end of the season, but there were some losses there as well. So we go on to the next slide now. This just shows you how much production there is in all those different counties that are expecting losses. And so the production value there is such that if you have a hurricane come through, everything is very vulnerable, and the chance of losing a lot is very, very large. In the next slide, we look at some of the losses for Georgia. They had estimated losses of almost $6.5 billion. And this is just to agriculture. This is not to everything else. So that includes the lost crops and the livestock, infrastructure, chicken houses, and replacing equipment and trees. They lost at least a third of the cotton crop, which was getting close to harvest stage. I've seen various estimates for the number of chicken houses that were lost, somewhere between 100 and 200 chicken houses. Just hundreds of thousands of pecan trees blown down, and pine trees, of course, because pine and forestry is a big agricultural industry in that part of the region. Florida producers said the losses in their part of the path were worse than Idalia last year for peanuts and livestock because of the timing of it as well. So just tremendous impacts on agriculture. And of course, many of these are multi-year impacts that will continue to plague the producers there for the next decade more in some cases. So if we go on, we look just briefly at Milton, and I know I'm running out of time here. There were estimates of 1.5 to 2.5 billion losses to Florida agriculture. They declared 34 out of 51 counties as disaster areas, and many of these places were places that had been affected by other hurricanes as well, especially Ian a few years ago and Idalia last year. So it's been kind of a double or even triple whammy for some of these places. Citrus has been pretty hard hit. They're still assessing the losses there because they were able to harvest some of their fruit ahead of time, but some of it fell on the ground. They have limited uses for that. Some of it was just shaken to the point where it may just rot on the trees, and so that's something. Also, greenhouses, vegetables, row crops, and fruit. It's a big production area for agriculture there in Central Florida as well. So if we go on, there's a lot of intangible impacts on Southeast farmers as well. Some estimates say that 2024 for the U.S. overall could be the worst year for farmers since 2007. This includes the impacts of drought up in the Corn Belt and so on, but definitely the hurricanes are a huge part of that as well. And many of these farmers have just had repeated losses from all the different hurricanes that we've had coming up through the Southeast. There's an estimate that somebody from the Farm Bureau said to me that about 20% of the farmers may not make it through this year because of the extreme losses, combined with all the other things they've had from Michael and so on. Some of them are still paying off loans that they had to take on from Michael in 2018 with the losses there. Mental health in farming families has really plummeted. There's a lot of calls to the helplines that are available through phones. A lot of farmers did not qualify for hurricane insurance because of the way the policies are written. I've gotten many phone calls on that, and it's a huge frustration. If you buy insurance, you expect it to pay, and if it doesn't, then a huge source of frustration. And many impacts from hurricanes are still to be determined, and so there could be things that could still be added or taken away from that. So we go on to the last page. This is the rest of the growing season. Right now, we've been, as Chris mentioned, in this really widespread pattern of very dry weather with persistent high pressure across the area. I looked ahead on the forecast. It looks to me like the pattern will probably continue this way until early November, when it starts to looks like it will break down. We may see some fronts start to move into the region, maybe around the end of the first week in November, but it could be dry for a couple of weeks yet. And so no wonder we're talking about October being potentially a record-setting dry month. Temperature forecasts do not show likelihood of frost, except in maybe the highest elevations in the most northern parts of the region. So I think the growing season is going to continue for a while yet. Maybe be good for the peanut growers who are trying to just get a little bit more growth on their plants before they harvest. And I think once we hit the end of the first week of November, we're probably going to go back into a more winter type pattern where we're going to start to see more rain. But that's going to be a while. Of course, I didn't really mention the tropics here. The tropics are quiet right now. We still have a month to go in the tropical season. There's some indication there could be more development in the Western Caribbean. Of course, we have no idea what that will be and where those storms will go. It's just something to keep in mind. If we go on, this is my summary sheet. I'm not going to talk about this, but I did want to mention one thing. We're going into November. It's a time period where we always give thanks. And I think we really need to recognize the farmers and the people who work with farmers, like extension agents and private suppliers of chemicals and so on, because we all need to eat and we all need to wear clothes. And those folks work so hard to provide that to the rest of us. And sometimes it's just really hard. And so thank you, farmers, thank you, extension agents, and thank you, all the folks that work with them to provide what we need. And that's all I've got. And so, Meredith, I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but I will hold on.
That is wonderful, Pam. Thank you so much for that really informative review of what was a traumatic season. Your analogy of a windshield wiper going back and forth, I thought was excellent. I have that in my mind. And then, of course, your reminder for all of us to be appreciative every day of what the producers and the support system around that go through for the food on our table. Hello, everyone. My name is Meredith Muth. I am a regional coordinator at the NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, the NIDIS program. We co-organize this webinar series with the National Weather Service and with the Southeast Regional Climate Center. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please enter those into our question box. I would like to take a moment to remind you that a summary and the recording of this webinar will be shared with you via email in a day or two, and it will also be posted on the U.S. Drought portal, drought.gov, so it's easy for you to share with your networks and your colleagues. I did want to mention that our next webinar, November 19th, we'll be talking about a timely topic All of our speakers spoke about the expected arrival of La Niña. It was mentioned several times. So tune in next month and you'll hear an update on that from the National Weather Service on what to expect in the rest of for the winter outlook. So at this time, for questions, I have one question, and I think this can go to anybody. It is about the jet stream and drought. The jet stream seems to be in a wave that dips south over the southeast. How has the jet stream, affected the drought and rainstorms? So a bit more of a meteorological question here for you.
Well, I can jump in and talk about that first, and maybe some of the others will want to. The jet stream is really where the biggest gradient of temperature is between the poles and the equator, and it does move to the north and south with the influence of these waves. The jet stream is what is usually associated with pushing around the weather systems that give us rain, so that when the jet stream is over us, we tend to be rainier and cloudier. And as we expect this winter, if the La Nina happens, that jet stream may be pushed to the north. That leaves us on the warm side of that front and without a lot of storms coming right over us. So the jet stream is definitely related to more cloudy conditions and usually more rain as well.
That's great, Pam. Does any of our other speakers want to add to that? That's perfect. I have another question. I'm going to put this one for you, Pam. It's a question that you may not be able to answer because it is policy related more than, I would say, weather, climate, and crop related to crop insurance for producers. Do you know why a farmer that purchased crop insurance will not be covered due to hurricane damage, as this seems weather related?
The hurricane insurance is related to what they consider to be where the hurricane winds occurred. Those hurricane winds are not, at least initially, were not based on actual observations. Then there's some reasons for that, but they're based on what the National Hurricane Center said was the likely area of where hurricanes occurred. And I showed that on an earlier slide. It was actually a pretty narrow band. There's a couple reasons for that. One is because it's much quicker to get that so they can get payments to the farmers more quickly. Another one is that we had a lot of stations that went offline during Helene, and so the observations were somewhat limited. I have provided a lot of data from the UGA Weather Network to FEMA to help try to fill in some of those areas, but that takes a while to do. So it may be that they will update the map of who's eligible, but in a lot of cases, there's just not data to support it, even though you see what the damage is and how bad it was. And so, yeah, it's the way that the insurance was written based on the specific data sets that they're using. And I'm sure that they did it with the best intentions, but in this case, Helene was interacting with a front, and so the winds were actually the strongest out ahead of where the eye was, rather than right at the eye itself, which is what we expect in a more classical hurricane over the ocean.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pam. And with that, we have no more questions at this time. I'd like to again thank our speakers today for joining us. This is a fantastic team, and we look forward to seeing all of you next month to talk about La Niña's, hopefully. Well, we'll find out. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.